All right, morning. Welcome everyone to today's a16z crypto research seminar. Very happy to introduce Georg Fuchsbauer from TU Wien, who's done lots of kind of very deep work in cryptography. And today we have the benefit of getting a tutorial from him specifically on blind signatures. So take it away.
Thanks, Tim. So I'll talk about blind signatures and some applications. And since this is a16z, I'll focus mainly on applications to blockchain protocols. Okay, so let's start with some basics. What's a signature scheme? So we have a signer or singer called Sai, who has a verification key and a signing key. And he can use the signing key to produce signatures on any message, which can then be verified using his verification key. What's a blind signature scheme? So here now we have another participant, so meet Yuma, the user. She has some message and she wants to get a signature on that message from Sai without revealing the message to Sai. So they run a protocol at the end of which Yuma holds a signature that verifies under Sai's public key. But we want blindness. So we want Sai not to learn the message that he signed. Moreover, we want something stronger, which is that if he later sees the signature, he cannot link it to any of the signature issuings that he has run in the past. Now, in terms of unforgeability, all we can ask for, since Sai doesn't know what he's signing, what we will ask is that if he runs this signature issuing protocol n times, then no one can produce n+1 signatures. And that's called one more unforgeability. Okay, what has this concept been introduced for first? It was by David Pointcheval using eCash, and I'll talk about this briefly. It was also considered for e-voting. So for example, in a voting protocol, you authorize you identify to the voting authority, and then you get a blind signature on your vote, and then you can later cast it and it is authenticated, but the authority doesn't see what you voted. More generally, you can build anonymous credentials from it, which I guess a nice application would be to have like a privacy-preserving ID, where when you go out to buy alcohol, you can prove that you're older than 21 without revealing your actual birth date. And recently, there has been a lot of renewed interest in the concept due to applications in contact tracing, advanced VPNs, private relays, private access tokens, privacy paths, and Bitcoin blind coin swaps. And I'll talk more about the last application. By the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time. It would be nice if this is interactive. Yes?
Just a sanity check for me. FHE would just solve blind signatures,
yes.
Right? Okay, good.
So the question was whether fully homomorphic encryption would solve this problem. Yes, because the user could just encrypt the signature, the signer evaluates the signing functionality on the ciphertext, gives it back to the user decrypts and has a signature on the message. Yeah, we want something efficient. But that would, solve the problem.
And should I think of in the voting example, you talked about some kind of like authority that you go to get. Should I think of that as kind of the canonical type of application?
I think eCash is, and I'll show like this Chaumian eCash, which I think is kind of that really also shows you this one more unforgeability why this is important. Okay, so for those who are interested, here's a first instantiation which uses RSA. So the RSA assumption says that if I have n, the product of two large prime numbers, and some public exponent e, then it is hard to compute eth roots modulo n. Okay, so if you don't like number theory, here's a nice abstraction, that's all you need to know. There's a function that takes an input, and this function is defined as raising it to the power of e modulo n, and that's efficient to compute using square and multiply. And the RSA assumption says that you can't go back, right? If I give you the evaluation of that function, you can't find a pre-image. And what makes RSA particularly interesting is that there is a way of going back if you have a secret trapdoor. So this is actually a trapdoor one-way permutation in crypto terms. And you can set up this, when you generate this modulus n, you can generate it together with the secret key that allows you to invert the function. Okay, here's how you build signatures from this. Also conceptually a very simple idea. This is RSA full domain hash, called like this because before you start, you first hash the message, and we assume that this hash is a number between 0 and n. And then a signature on that message is simply the inversion of the RSA function, right? You compute f inverse on the hash of the message, and that's your signature, right? How can you verify signatures?
Encrypt.
Yes?
You encrypt it back.
Exactly. So basically, if you see a signature, since that is easy to do in public, you can check whether if you evaluate F on it, you get back the hash of the message. Now, Chom's idea was to turn this into a blind signature scheme. And so again, the only property you need to know about this F is that it's homomorphic, and its inverse is also homomorphic, because if you raise x0 times x1 to the power of e, that's the same as raising x0 to the power of e and multiplying with x1 to the power of e. Here's how blind signing works. The user chooses some random value r in the RSA domain, computes the hash of the message, and then blinds it by multiplying it by f of r and sends that to the signer. And since f is also a bijection and r is uniformly random, this perfectly hides the message. So m prime doesn't contain any information about the message. Now what the signer does is compute f inverse on this blinded message, m prime. So how can the user obtain a signature on the message from sigma prime? So basically what she does is she takes this blinded signature and divides by r, and I claim that that is an RSA signature, because if you just plug in, so what is sigma prime? It's f inverse of this blinded message, so that's this divided by r. Now we use the property that f inverse is homomorphic, so this is f inverse of the hash times f inverse of f of r, that's r, and that cancels out with r, right? And so she has obtained sigma defined like this. Okay, so what was the first, as I said, like the canonical example, what you can build from a blind signature scheme, and that Chom had as initial motivation for this is a classical
So
e-cache.
R is part of the blind signature? R is m prime comma r, or?
R is gone, right? The blind signature, so the
No, but like the
final
communication protocol.
So
like R needs to be sent back to...
so R, the user keeps R and then uses it to unblind the blind signature, right? But then the final signature is deterministic, so R is not part of the blind signature. Yeah. Okay, how can you do e-cache, or what is e-cache? So the motivation was, can you have a digital analog of physical cache? And in particular, can you have something anonymous as cache? So can we have a protocol where the client can withdraw coins from the bank, can then spend these coins with merchants, for example, Marcellus, the merchant, so that then later the merchant can deposit these coins at the bank and get his account credited, right? The question is, can you have anonymity? And so I was at an event about the digital euro, and there was some Austrian central banker, and so he explained a lot of economic properties about the digital euro, and then I asked, what about privacy? And then he said, well, if the bank gives you a token, then obviously when the token comes back to you, it can link, so you can't have privacy. And I thought, okay, I'll stop asking cryptographic questions. Okay, so what can you do? What can you use? Blind signatures, right? So how can you get anonymity? We want to make sure that the bank doesn't know what coin Alice withdrew. And so how is this done? The client picks a random serial number from a large enough space, so there's no like realistic chance of collisions, gets a blind signature on the serial number from the bank, and that is her coin, right? So it's a serial number together with a signature by the bank. When she wants to use the coin to spend it, she just passes on this information, and then you immediately see, well, it's not physical, it's digital, you can copy it. What about double spending? How can we prevent the client from spending this anywhere? And so this is online e-cache, and the solution is very simple. It's basically like in Bitcoin. You check whether it's already been spent, right? So when the merchant receives a coin, it first asks the bank, is this a coin that hasn't been spent yet? The bank needs to remember all the coins it ever received. And if not spent yet, then the merchant can give the goods, right?
Sorry,
yes.
can you explain what that means, what a spent means here?
Okay, so the bank just remembers, it doesn't know which coins it issued, right? That was blind, but it knows what coins it already received for payments, like deposited coins. And so the idea is basically you don't accept the coin before you deposit it, and so the bank can check whether it was already spent before. Yes?
So the merchant now can't use that coin again?
Yes.
Okay.
That's true, yeah. So there's So, okay, since you're asking, there's many variants of eCash. So the first one was offline eCash. Can I have a system where the merchant doesn't have to talk to the bank? So basically, any merchant optimistically accepts coins. And somehow in this spending protocol, the client has to encode her identity in the coin in a way that's still anonymous. But if the same coin was deposited twice at the bank, then there's a mechanism of retrieving Alice's identity. And so then that's actually not yet your question. Then you can do transferable offline eCash. That's something that I've worked on, and it's probably the most secure scheme is probably one we did some years ago, where you want to have the merchant being able to retransfer the coin, and then at some point it goes back to the bank. And if at any of these transfers there was a double spending, you can retrieve the wrongdoer by extracting the identity. But as long as there was no double spending, everything is anonymous. So these are things you can do with like cool crypto tricks. Okay, so that's all very 1980s. So you might wonder, what can blind signatures do for us in a blockchain context? So as a motivation, consider the Lightning Network. So that's a protocol that allows you to do off-chain payments in Bitcoin, but I don't want to get into any details of it. All you need to know is that there's a way of opening so-called payment channels between users, so that if, say this is like a payment hub, if Alice has a channel to the hub and the hub has a channel to Bob, then Alice can send Bitcoins to Bob via this payment hub. And they can even do incremental payments without putting anything on chain, but yeah, not relevant for this talk. Okay, what's relevant is how this is done. So the way it's done is that Alice creates a Bitcoin transaction that needs two signatures to be spent, right? One by Alice and one by the payment hub. And if both, basically there's signatures by both of them, then you can think of this Bitcoin being transferred to the hub. So really there's more than one transaction, but I'm abstracting away details. Okay, so what's the protocol? Alice signs this transaction. So basically her Bitcoin is now escrowed in this transaction. The payment hub does the same for his channel with Bob. And then they can transaction. Then when they close the channel, they all put the missing signature, and then all the Bitcoins are basically transferred to the receiver. Okay, what's the problem here? The problem is if we go back, what if Alice signs and then the payment hub just signs as well, takes Alice's coin and never pays Bob, right? That's something that you want to prevent in these Lightning channels. So how can this be done? Not clear a priori. It's Bitcoin, so you can't just encode any statements you want into the spending of a coin. But I guess an artifact of,
So maybe first, what would you do if you did have full programmability? How would you solve the problem?
Say that this transaction can only be taken if that transaction is on the chain or something like that. Yeah. Okay, but basically the problem we want is we want these things to be atomic, meaning that either both payments go through or none of them does, right? There's a fair thing, right? Of course, the payment hub can just abandon, but then it doesn't steal Alice's coin. As I said, it's not clear a priori how to do this in Bitcoin, but there's one functionality that Bitcoin has, which arguably is an artifact of how Bitcoin addresses are defined, because it's the hash of a public key. And so it has this functionality that you can use to encode spending conditions, which is called a hash lock. So what the payment hub does is it chooses a random value x and it hashes it, and then it can encode into this transaction the value y and say that you can only take this transaction if you know a preimage, right? So now this secret x needs to be known to take this transaction. And now I argue that now you get atomicity by the following protocol. So the hub goes first, encodes, so the hub is the only one who knows secret x. There's a transaction that you can only take if you have x. So now the hub can safely sign this transaction because it knows as long as I don't publish x, this cannot be taken. Now Alice, so it communicates y to Alice. Alice, so yeah, the Bitcoin is escrowed here. Alice, in her transaction, also puts this hash lock in there. So for spending this transaction, you also need to know X. Alice signs this transaction, but now either nothing happens and then there's like time locks as well, so everything is reverted that you can do in Bitcoin. But if the payment hub takes the first transaction, it needs to publish the secret value X, right? And now Alice can give the secret value to Bob, and Bob can take the second payment. Okay, so in terms of security or like economic security, that's good. What's bad about this is privacy. So there might not only be Alice and Bob that transact via this hub, there might be another Alice and another Bob that transact, or a third Alice and a third Bob, and all of these transactions have the same hash lock, right? And so you can link them. And this is the problem that Tumblebit wants to solve or does solve using blind signatures.
What's the linkability again?
Oh, if you see, so once these transactions are posted on chain because the channel is closed, you see the transaction and you see the hash lock that was used, and you know that these two things belong together because they have the same hash lock, because that's exactly what ensures.
So there's no
atomicity.
mixing at the hub, you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe same question. So this is the regular Bitcoin transaction has this problem too. So you're trying to do better using payment hubs. You want the payment hub to at the same time serve as an
exactly.
X.
You want to have some. Like for example, you could think of this hub being a mixing service. Like a lot of people put Bitcoin in there, it mixes it, people get their Bitcoins out, everyone's guaranteed I get something out, that's atomicity, but then there's no linkability between what went in and what goes out. Hence the name Tumblebit, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so here's the idea of Heilmann et al. Instead of requiring a hash pre-image to redeem this transaction, they require an RSA signature. Okay, so now the payment hub selects some random message M and says that you can only take this transaction here if you have a signature on M. And basically, so the payment hub has the secret key. So what changes now? On this side of the protocol, what Alice can do, of course, if Alice puts the same signature, like basically buys a signature for Bitcoin, nothing is gained. But now we can use the blinding of RSA, because what she does is she buys a blinded signature, right? So she takes the message M, runs the blind signing protocol, and says, payment hub, can you please issue a blind signature on this blinded message? Here's a transaction, which you can only take if you give me a blinded signature, right? And so if the payment hub complies, then Alice can unblind the signature, give it to Bob, and Bob can redeem this transaction. That's something that you could encode in Ethereum, but the problem is in Bitcoin you can't, because RSA signature verification is not an opcode. So what they do is they play some tricks to get the same functionality, but using different means.
Sorry, and how do you verify a blinded signature?
How does Alice know that sigma prime corresponds to her blinded message?
She's not the only one that needs to check, right? Somebody else also has to check, or no?
No, she's the one that puts in, so basically she puts in, if this worked, the blinded message M prime, and says that only if the payment hub puts RSA inverse on M prime in there, which is something you can check, then the payment,
I see. Okay.
you can take the payment.
She puts the blinded message there.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of what before was the hash value is now the blinded message. What before was the pre-image of the hash value is now like an inverse of the RSA function, which is the blinded signature.
Do you run into like issues if Alice is malicious because you're not checking that it's the hash of message times some randomness, or?
I mean, here think of it as Alice can't really do anything. I mean, if Alice is malicious,
she just loses her money.
She loses her money, exactly. It's in her interest that he puts the correct thing in there. Yeah.
And then to follow up, does the merchant need to check something?
Basically, so Alice and the merchant, they are like, Alice wants to buy something from the merchant, right? And the merchant says, I give you the goods. Once you give me that signature, I need to get the money. So so Alice can, or whoever blinded it can unblind the message, can unblind the signature, and then use it to redeem the second transaction.
Who knows M?
Basically everyone. That's So M is kind of the statement that's encoded in the transaction, and sigma is the witness that you want for that transaction.
M is just public.
Yeah, exactly. M is public. But the thing is that here there's only an M prime, and so things are, and that's like information theoretically unrelated to M, and so the two payments are unlinkable. Here's how you get this actually to work. So what we want here is we want to have a mechanism so that if Bob has a signature on M, he gets the payment, and otherwise he doesn't, right? So the way they do this is that the hub sends the challenge, the message for which Bob needs a signature, and then it just encrypts tau h, which is the transaction signature that makes this transaction go through, under the key that is the signature on M, right? So as long as you don't have a signature, this transaction you can't take it because you can't decrypt. If you have a signature, you can use it to decrypt the ciphertext. You obtain the transaction signature, you sign the rest, and then you get the payment. Okay, so that's one side of the protocol. Here's how Alice can blindly buy a signature using very similar tricks. So she sends the blinded message M prime, and now the payment hub can produce sigma prime from it by using its secret key. It won't send it, right, because Alice can just take it and give it to Bob, and then the payment hub loses the money. So again, they want some contingent mechanism. And so now, instead of sending sigma prime to Alice, the payment hub encrypts it under some random key. Now Alice can't obtain anything. So what can we do? How can we make sure that Alice only gets the key if she pays? But if she gets the key, she gets the signature, that's what she wanted, right? How can we make sure she only gets the key when she pays? Use hash lock again. So the payment hub sends Alice the hash of the key. This shouldn't endanger the ciphertext, assuming the hash function is good and one way. Alice now makes a payment that says, you can only take this payment if you give me that key. So if the hub takes the payment, so she signs it, if the hub takes the payment, needs to publish the key, Alice can decrypt the ciphertext and thus obtain what she wanted, namely sigma prime. So once she has sigma prime, okay, so first of all, because now everything's signed, that Bitcoin goes to the hub. Alice has sigma prime by decrypting C prime. She unblinds sigma prime to get sigma. She gives sigma to Bob. Bob uses sigma to decrypt this ciphertext, gets a transaction signature by the payment hub, completes it by his own signature, and thus receives the other Bitcoin.
So
yes.
you need the payment hub to prove that it put in the correct signature there,
yes,
right? So
exactly.
there you need that.
So that's all nice if the payment hub is honest, right? And that's actually an encryption of a payment hub signature under an RSA signature and so on.
Sorry.
So to link
also, what is the encryption? So C is equal to encryption of sigma comma T, like the top. What is you're encrypting to knowledge of a signature? What exactly is that saying?
That can just be any symmetric encryption scheme. I mean, typically you would hash sigma first to have
I see.
a
So
key
it's
format.
any symmetric key encryption scheme.
Yeah.
But what is the condition you're encoding there in some sense? Basically, Bob should only be able to decrypt it, or the receiver should only be able to decrypt it if it receives the blind signature, right?
If it has a signature that goes with M.
Because the payment provider or the payment hub knows the sigma, it's just like some kind of chem. I see. Okay.
That also relies on the fact that RSA signatures are deterministic. It wouldn't work with a probabilistic signature scheme. Yeah.
Do you think this flow would be simplified if you had witness encryption to knowledge of a signature or something?
That's kind of where I'm building up to.
Okay.
You can simplify all of this.
Okay.
So maybe, you don't have to think any further. Okay, but first of all, obviously...
So sorry, that whole previous discussion was about what goes wrong if the hub wants to lie about C?
Exactly. The hub can just put anything in there. The hub can put anything in there, right? All this argument relied on the fact that these things are well formed. So in particular, how can Alice be sure that C prime is correct? So what would be the statement? The statement is C prime is so there exists some key K such that C prime is an encryption of sigma prime, where sigma prime is a blinded signature for M prime, and K is a pre-image of Y, right? That's kind of the conditions you would have to encode.
Yeah, so really, how can Alice be sure that C prime and Y are correct? Right?
Exactly. So how can she be sure? Use a zero-knowledge proof, right? And that is exactly the idea of zero-knowledge contingent payments, which is a protocol that uses exactly this idea of adding a proof that these things are well-formed. And since you can prove basically any NP statement here, so that this witness sigma verifies, what you can do is so zero-knowledge contingent payments is a protocol that allows you to buy NP witness for anything you want for Bitcoin in a fair way. And so the first use case that Maxwell, who invented it, did was a protocol where the statement is a Sudoku puzzle, and then you have an atomic swap where you can buy a Sudoku puzzle for Bitcoin, and either everyone gets what they wanted or no one gets anything. And so it's like a fair exchange protocol.
But does this require the encryptor to know what the solution is, or?
Yes, otherwise you can break NP, right? I mean,
So it's not like witness encryption.
no, it's no. Here, yeah, the thing that's encrypted is something that's known by, yeah. And this, yeah, so this protocol was then broken by Campanelli, Gennaro, Goldfader, Nizzardo, and fixed, and then I broke theirs again and fixed it, and so now it seems to work with Groth 16, which they used at the time. There was some problem with who sets up the parameters for the proof system, right? And so they said, well, the verifier can, but then you have a problem if the verifier cheats, and so that's why you need actually subversion zero knowledge, which is a concept that we introduced. Anyway, that's not what they do, because like proving RSA statements is kind of messy, probably using snarks. I mean, the Sudoku puzzle is a really simple circuit that checks whether something's a Sudoku puzzle. This would be a lot more complex. So what they do is use cut and choose techniques, meaning that basically Alice sends a lot of blinded messages to the hub, and then the hub the hub like encrypts it. Then Alice selects a subset and the hub has to open them, and Alice can just check whether that was correct, right? And if there was anything incorrect, there's a good probability of catching the hub. The problem is that there's many problems, because you want to avoid Alice. Well, first you want to avoid this opening proof that Alice can then get a signature, right? And so basically what you do is Alice sends blinded versions of M prime or actual images for which she already knows the solution, and then she opens these. But then you also want to make sure that Alice can't obtain more than one signature, so you have to do additional things, so you end up like in a 3-round protocol. Okay, same thing for Bob, right? Here they also propose a cut and choose based protocol that uses randomizability of RSA to make sure that this is correct. Okay, let's zoom out and look at what we want to achieve in this part here. Basically, Bob wants to buy a Bitcoin if and only if he has some signature, right? But that seems very related to what Bitcoin does anyway, right? But because to get Bitcoin, you need a signature on a transaction. The problem is that if this is an RSA signature, Bitcoin doesn't accept them. So why don't you just replace RSA by something that Bitcoin accepts, namely Schnorr? And then this part of the protocol is basically done, right? Because now Bob can create a transaction from an address of the payment hub, and then says that, and then if he gets a signature from the payment hub on this transaction, he gets the Bitcoin. That's the buy specification of Bitcoin. Now let's look at the other part. Is there maybe also a way, once we switch from RSA to Schnorr, of this blindly buying a signature in a fair way from Bitcoin? Okay, so now let's enter another technical part. So I'll explain Schnorr signatures and blind Schnorr signatures.
Sorry, just to go back.
Yes.
So you're saying like if you can do this, the second transaction is just going to be a normal, like pay to Schnorr public key hash kind of transaction.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Because it's kind of, this is like getting Bitcoin if you know some signature from the sender. That's if the signature is a
So they'll just use the merchant's public key or whatever, right? Or public, like Schnorr public key or whatever.
the hub's so the hub is paying the merchant, right? So the hub's public key, and if you the merchant makes a transaction, gets a signature on this transaction from the hub, then gets the money because it has a signed transaction.
And remind me why the hub can't claim it in that case?
Because the transaction basically says transfer 1 Bitcoin to Marcellus.
Oh, right. The recipient's hard-coded.
Exactly. And
Okay.
if once it signs, the money is gone, right? The
So
recipient
the hub
can
could
just
go
take
ahead
it.
and publish the transaction if they wanted, but the money would go to the merchant in any case. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
It could also publish a transaction but not sign it yet, and then say if you have a signature, you get it. That's how Bitcoin is defined. Now, is there a way of getting the signature blindly by Alice? So we'll focus on the first part now. Okay, here's Schnorr signatures. Now we're in typically an elliptic curve group of order Q, generated by some generator G, and we have a hash function that maps bit strings into ZQ. Secret keys are elements in ZQ. Verification key is X times G, so note that I use additive notation, so this is often written as G to the power of X, but it's the same. So basically the discrete logarithm problem says that if I give you this group element X, you can't find little x, its exponent. Now, to show how signing works, it's instructive to look at where this Schnorr signature actually comes from, and it's from an identification protocol. So meet Marcel Proust, the prover, and Jules Verne, the verifier. They run a protocol where the prover convinces the verifier that he knows the secret key corresponding to the public key. So how is this done? So the prover starts by generating an ephemeral key pair. So it picks a random scalar x, computes the group element r times g, sends it to the verifier. The verifier chooses a random challenge in ZQ, and the prover should now reply with r that he picked before plus the challenge times the secret key. And you can show that if the prover convinces the verifier, it should do so for a lot of challenges C. And if you get 2 S's for 2 different C's, then you can basically from these 2 equations compute the secret key. So that's why it's really a proof of knowledge. You can only do this if you know X. Okay, how can the verifier check whether S has this form? It's basically check the equation in the exponent, right? So here we don't have exponents, but basically if you multiply this equation by the generator, you get that S times G equals little r times G, which is capital R, plus C times the key. And that's exactly how you verify Schnorr signatures as well. Okay, so how do you turn this into a signature scheme?
Generate C from a hash.
Exactly. Use the Fiat-Shamir transform, use a random oracle to generate this challenge value C, or in real-world implementation, use a hash function. So the signer just runs this protocol on its own, and instead of waiting for a verifier challenge, it creates it using a hash function on the first protocol message and also the message. So now you can bake the message into this protocol. So that's called the Fiat-Shamir transform of this protocol. And so this was shown to be an unforgeable digital signature scheme in the random oracle model if this group is discrete logarithm hard. And that was proven by my academic father and grandfather, Pointcheval and Stern. Okay, how can we turn this into a blind signature scheme? So let's go back to the identification scheme. So we had Marcel and Jules, but since this is more modern, they should be Marcellus and Jules, in case you know the characters. Anyway, so the idea is that basically the blind signer and the user run this protocol interactively, because now what the user can do, the user can compute this challenge. So compute the hash with the message, and now arguably the message is hidden. And then the signer finishes the protocol. So it's not a blind signature because basically if the signer later sees a signature, it's exactly the R and the S value that it sent, so it's easy to link, right? So it doesn't work yet. So Schnorr's idea...
You're saying
yes?
the user is just computing the user is choosing the R and computing the hash function, you're saying? Pardon? So far. The user is choosing the R and computing the hash function so far.
The the R is sent by the signer, but then the user kind of creates this challenge that in the regular signature protocol the signer would create because it knows the message, but now let's outsource that to the user because it's the user that knows the message, right? It's the first idea, but it doesn't work since we also want the signature not to reveal anything about the signing session. So what Schnorr came up with is, I think, a very cute observation that you can actually blind these values. So what the user does is she samples alpha and beta random blinding values. She receives this first message R, and now she blinds it into a message R prime, which is R plus alpha times generator plus beta times X. Okay? Why it's done like that, you'll see later. And that will be the first component of the blind signature, right? So now it's, by these blinding factors, it's unrelated to what the signer saw. She now computes the hash value that goes with this R prime, right? So she hashes R prime, public key, and the message. Now, obviously, she can't send this hash value because, again, then the signer learns something about the message. So what she does is she also blinds this by using this beater again. So she sends a blinded version of the challenge to the signer, and then the signer just does what it did before. Two apparently seemingly unrelated values, right? But it turns out that if you do this calculation, that if you take this value S received from the signer, you add your blinding value alpha to it, then that pair is actually a valid signature. So you can kind of, this blind unblind trick also works for Schnorr. And what's also not too hard to see is that this scheme satisfies blindness, actually perfect blindness. So the signing session is information theoretically unrelated to the resulting signature. Because what does the signer see? It sees the final signature R prime S prime. It sees the value C, but actually, yeah, if you look at R prime, then alpha is kind of an independent random value that completely blinds R. This value C that the signer sees is completely blinded by beta. Now it seems there's a third value, but that's just uniquely determined by anything else, right? For every R-C combination, there's only one S that makes it a valid signature. And so, yeah, the blinder doesn't learn anything. Sorry, the signer.
What is C prime here? I see.
Sorry, yeah, this one I didn't spell. So C prime would be the hash value that went with the actual signature. So you could think as the Schnorr signature being like, it's like a value R, a value C, which is the hash value, and the value S. But really you only need two of them. And so, yeah, the argument is that although the signer learns C prime, which is just by verifying this final signature, the value C doesn't reveal anything because it's blinded by beta. So there's three values where one of them is determined by the other two, and the remaining two are both blinded by independent random values. That's kind of the argument.
So if you only cared about a computational version of blindness, could you just skip the beta?
I don't know if there's anything simple. I think it's just a nice effect that you get perfect blindness.
Okay, but like, why do you need the beta? Like, what goes wrong?
Why do you need the beta? If the user sent just this hash value, the signer can remember it and then see if that's the hash value that goes with the final signature. So that would link it again.
That would link the hash value.
So when you get the signature, R prime, S prime on some message, you don't know which signing session it was from, but you can determine, like when you verify it, you compute this hash value here, right? That's for verifying the signature. And if this hash value turns out to be something that you've seen in a signing protocol, then you can link it to that signing session. So you also need to blind C.
So you're saying only later, when it sees like M, sigma, only then will it be able to relate it back?
If you don't blind C, yes,
if
exactly.
You don't blind.
Yes,
I see.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yes.
in the blind signature model, the signer is not the verifier.
No, the signer is the prover. Signer is the one who knows the secret key.
So why would the signer see the future verification of this signature?
Because in real, like, think of the
Because it's
eCash
public.
example, right? I'm the bank, Alice withdraws a coin. I remember the C value. Later I see a signature that has that C value. I know that it's the coin that I gave to Alice.
Also, like, this may be a bit weird question. Why do we need a hash function? Why can't I just like sample a random string that somehow depends on all these values? Like, Like we're not doing fiat Shamir here anymore because the protocol is actually
but
interactive.
you want to have a Schnorr signature at the end, right? That's where the hash function is from. So you want this final thing to.
I thought the reason that Schnorr uses a hash function was because it's not interactive anymore, right? If it was interactive.
No, that's a correction.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. So yeah, you have the signature scheme. You want to make it non-interactive. The blind signature scheme, it's necessarily interactive because the user has to intervene with its message. And so yeah, you want to have a hash here because in the end you want to have a Schnorr signature. And that's also that's kind of, as you see later, that's kind of, there's a lot of blind signature schemes in the literature. But if you want to do stuff on Bitcoin, you can't just invent your own signature scheme. You need to have a blind signing protocol for an existing signature scheme. And that's kind of one of the things that we did. Well, we'll come to that. Good. For everyone? Yes?
Are you going to comment on ECDSA at all, or what's known there?
No. So for ECDSA, I mean, we want provable security, right? ECDSA, there are blind ECDSA signing protocols, but since ECDSA itself doesn't have a security proof, it's kind of moot to think of whether the blind signing protocol is secure. That's why I think it's less interesting. And that's why I also think like the world is moving towards Schnorr with DSA anyway. Okay, that's debatable. Bitcoin did, and like the most conservative thing does. Yes?
Can you explain again the role of that hash? Yes, that one.
If we go back to Schnorr signatures, in the end, what you want is, so the signature is a pair of a group element R and an integer S, such that this equation satisfies where C is defined as the hash of the first signature element, the public key, and the message, right? So in the blind signing protocol, you need to somehow make this C, this hash appear because it will be part of the verification equation of the final signature. So the value S will depend on it.
I see. And if you don't care about that, then there's many other ways to do that part. Right? If you don't care about the final signature being a standard Schnorr signature, then there are many ways to do this.
Yes, I mean, there's just different approaches of where you don't use a Schnorr signature, yeah. Okay, good. So if you zoomed out and you don't care about the details of Schnorr, let's get back to our cryptocurrency example. So our motivation was that Alice wants to blindly buy in a fair way a Schnorr signature. And now all you need to know about Schnorr is that this is the verification equation. So Schnorr signature is a pair RS, so that S times G equals R plus C is the hash of Rx in the message and X is the public key. Okay, that's all we need. In order to buy a blind signature, there's a sub-step which is to buy a discrete logarithm. And that's all ideas by Jonas Nick. Well, let's first solve this problem. So we have the buyer who has some group element T and some Bitcoin. And she says, whoever gives me the discrete logarithm of this group element will be paid some Bitcoin. So here's the seller who has the discrete logarithm and wants to get some Bitcoin. And we want this thing to be atomic. So now we don't need hash locks because Schnorr signatures allow us to do a lot of cool tricks because of its structure. So the way the protocol works is that first, as before, they create a multisig output, except that now it's actually a Schnorr multi-signature. But you can think of this being a signature of the buyer and signature of the seller. Now what the seller does is it sends what's called an adapter signature, right? So it's like a Schnorr signature, except that this value S is not S, but S prime, and it doesn't satisfy the verification equation, because otherwise this signature would be that, and the buyer could just, no one could take the money, no, ignore that. But it has this structure here that S prime times G equals T, the element of which the discrete logs should be solved, plus R plus C times X. So it sends that. Alice can check. Once Alice got that, she signs the output. And now in order to take the money, again by this multi-signature stuff, details of which I won't get into, the seller now has to produce a signature with the same R value, right? So it has to produce a signature RS to get the Bitcoin so that this satisfies this equation here.
Sorry,
yes?
the C is hash of R, X, and T and M or something, or?
In this,
in the adapter signature?
no, there's no T in there. It's just basically the transaction info, right? It's the signature on the transaction.
Oh, what's little c exactly?
C is so if for Schnorr signatures is the hash of the message, and here the message would be the transaction that's being signed. Okay, so now Bob produced the signature and took the Bitcoin, and now Alice has lost her Bitcoin. How can she still get what she wanted? Yes?
She has RS prime and RS, so that's enough to...
Exactly. So if she computes S prime minus S, so if you subtract these two equations, then you see that S prime minus S is exactly the discrete log of T, because that's the only thing on the right-hand side that doesn't cancel out. So this adapter signature allows you to kind of do this conditional things where only if you take the money you will reveal something that allows you to get the secret that you wanted, as like an analog of these hash lock transactions before.
So is this sort of the same thing where like you're not supposed to reuse the nonce and then you're, or something like that, or?
No, because it's, so this is basically something that applies to the interactive protocol. Well, let's see here, the writers. So what Tim referred to was that if you run this protocol and you reuse the same R but answer a different C, then basically from the two resulting S's you can extract the secret key. So it's basically exactly what happens in a security proof should never happen in the real world. In the security proof you imagine that if this proof convinces the verifier, once this R is out, there must be a good chance of replying to a random challenge. And so there's a good chance of replying to two random challenges. And if so, then you can extract the key. But if you do it in the real world, then you lose your key. That's actually something that has happened, I think, for ECDSA that has the same problem. There was some Sony PlayStation, and that's how the secret key was extracted, because they didn't have a good randomness generation, so they used the same first message several times. Again, like abstracting away, what do we have now? We have a protocol that allows you in an atomic way of buying a discrete logarithm for Bitcoin. And once you have that, I argue that buying blind signatures is very straightforward, because what you do is, so now we want to buy a blind signature for Bitcoin. What you do is you just run the blind signing protocol. So the blind signer sends his message R, the user or the buyer sends her message C, and then the signer doesn't reply, otherwise the signature is gone and the Bitcoin is not there. So what they do instead, they run the protocol for buying this value S. And this value, the S, is the discrete log of something that the buyer can compute. So as you can see with Schnorr signatures, you can simplify these anonymous coin swaps a lot. In the remaining time, I'd like to focus more on blind Schnorr signatures and the security properties that we know of it. So I told you that blindness is something that you can easily check and it holds unconditionally, but it's kind of the blinder the thing gets, the less unforgeable it gets, right? There's a trade-off, right? So what do we know about one more unforgeability of Schnorr signatures? What do we mean by one more unforgeability? And I argue what we want is concurrent security. Why? Because if you look at an application of blind signing, think eCash, think a bank blindly signing a lot of serial numbers, you want to be protected against concurrent attacks. Why? Because there might not only be Yuma, the user, there might also be Usain, there might also be Yuri, and while Usain probably replies very quickly, Yuri might start a signing session, then disappear into space, and then the bank can't just wait until he comes back before he starts the next session, right? So you'll have this, because otherwise he's vulnerable to denial of service attacks. So you really want to have to interleave sessions, to start a lot of sessions and then close them later. So what we know about concurrent security of blind Schnorr is Schnorr himself showed that if the so-called ROS problem, which stands for random inhomogeneities in an overdetermined system of linear equations, if this problem is hard, then Schnorr signatures are secure in the generic group model and the random oracle model. Right? So that's very surprising in crypto proofs, because if you already assume all these idealizing things, then usually you don't have any assumptions you want to make, but here you even need assumptions. And so we showed that you can like show the same thing in the algebraic group model. But what he showed is that it's actually equivalent. He showed that if you can solve this ROS problem, then you can attack Bitcoin in a concurrent attack. And it was for a long time, it was not clear how difficult this ROS problem was. We knew that there were sub-exponential attacks, but then 4 years ago, there was a practical attack by Ben Hamouda et al., who showed that if you can open lambda, where lambda is a security parameter, think of 256, parallel sessions at the same time, then you can very efficiently compute lambda plus 1 signatures, right? Something you don't want from a blind signature scheme. Okay, so the open question was, can we define a secure blind signing protocol for Schnorr signatures? Again, there are concurrently secure blind signature schemes, but if we need to use Schnorr, because, for example, we want to use it in Bitcoin, or because we want to have a blind signing protocol for something that's standardized, like at DSA, then we need to like engineer around this existing signature scheme. Okay, so the attack obviously uses the fact that there's these concurrent sessions, and so what it does, it obtains a lot of R values, and then it engineers the C values in a malicious way, depending on all the R values, right? So an obvious way of preventing this attack could be to break this dependency. And so this was together with my student Matthias Wolf, who doesn't want pictures online, so I put someone else instead. The idea was that in a first round, the user commits to all her randomness, right? To the blinding values and her message. And then when she sends this challenge C, so note that now once the randomness is committed, this challenge C is like determined by the randomness and the value R, right? So there's only, if you prove that the C is well formed with respect to the things that you've committed, then there's only one C that you can send, and that breaks the attack. So it turns out that it does not only break the attack, but you can actually prove that that makes the scheme secure. So we show that you get one more unforgeability if you assume unforgeability of Schnorr, which for cryptographers is kind of a bad assumption, right? It's interactive, but in practice it's kind of, you wouldn't use a blind signing protocol for a signature scheme that's not secure, right? So that's kind of a minimum assumption you make on your system anyway. And you need to assume soundness of your proof system. So there's no other assumptions or idealized models or anything.
Wait, what do you mean you have to assume unforgeability of Schnorr? Isn't that known?
Yes, it's known in the random oracle model under the discrete log assumption.
Yeah.
But
you want
now
it from...
we prove a statement about this hash function, so we can't just pretend it's a random oracle. Right? That's why we kind of make the assumption that for a concrete hash function, Schnorr is secure, which is kind of just this interactive assumption, right? The adversary gets a public key, can ask for signatures, and then has to come up with
So pi is like a snark or whatever, like
yes.
general purpose.
Yes, yeah. Even if it wasn't, I mean, if it involves the statement, it can't be a random oracle, right? You can't prove,
Are you going to say anything about the intuition about why, without this trick, like, you know,
why
how the fails? Yeah, like
how the Ross attack works?
Yeah.
Okay, I can try. So it's basically.
I mean, if it's a bad idea, you don't have to do it.
It's a bit technical, but it's basically you have
to. Is there like 30,000 feet version or?
So what you want is you have all these R values, and you want to somehow get a linear combination of these R values and the corresponding S values, so that you can like satisfy. So you have. So you can view it as a system.
So what the attacker can do is choose all of the C's in a batch, knowing all of the R's.
Exactly. So basically, imagine you have a system of equations where every line is the verification of a Schnorr signature. You want to have lambda plus 1 lines, but then you only have lambda C's because that's the number of signing sessions. And on the right-hand side, you have something generated by the random oracle, which corresponds to this. This is why this random inhomogeneities of this equation. And now there's a way of obtaining a solution which are lambda c values, so that lambda 1 equations are satisfied. And if you get these, you can just do linear combinations of all the stuff you got and obtain lambda plus 1 Schnorr signatures. That's kind of the idea. And it depends on, that you know all the R values, and then you can choose the C's to your liking and not use what the SNARKs makes you use.
So lambda here is going to correspond to the number of bits of the right-hand side entries of these equations? Is that?
Lambda, it's basically the way you do this linear combination is by a bit decomposition. That's where the lambda comes from. I mean, you can also have it shorter by using like the old like combining the two attack, using the sub-exponential attack and this trick. So you don't need to go all the way to 256 signing sessions, but that's when the attack becomes completely practical, because then it's just,
And so if I could do this attack, I can just make the hub spend money to Bob without having to send money to the hub. Is that the consequence?
I think the simple example would be the classical eCash. It's basically Alice withdrawing lambda coins, but in parallel, and then obtaining lambda plus 1 coins.
I see.
Yeah, that's how severe the attack is. No, but it's really something you don't want in a blind signature scheme. That's nice and theoretical, right? But if you want to use it, you need to implement this proof. And so that's what we did in this paper. We gave 3 implementations using, at the time, 2023, which is ages ago in SNARK time, the state-of-the-art available SNARKs. So we used Groth16 and Plonk, which are 2 proof systems that require trusted parameters. And maybe a word on this. It's also kind of, you want, if you're in Bitcoin, everything's decentralized, who sets up these parameters? Or in this blind signature example, who sets up the parameters? And since that's like an older result where I showed that Groth16 is subversion zero knowledge, even if the parameters have been subverted, zero knowledge is maintained. And so here, who wants to be protected? It's the user. It's the signer that verifies the proof. So the signer can set up these parameters, and then the user can be sure that it's still this proof that she makes under the signer's parameters doesn't reveal anything about her message. Okay, and then Plonk. And since these are SNARKs, this is 400 bytes or so for Groth16, 800 bytes for Plonk, and they verify really fast. Surprisingly, with this implementation, Plonk was a lot faster than Groth16, which was not to be expected. So all these numbers are very depending on which libraries we use, and because nothing was really optimized. This was basically just to get some idea of feasibility. Okay, now we know that SNARKs are short. We know that they are fast to verify. The bottleneck is how complicated it is to create them, like the prover time. So this really depends on the statement, because you have to represent the statement as an arithmetic circuit, and then depending on how big the circuit is, that determines the prover time and the CRS size. So the statement is about these 2 things. So it depends on the elliptic curve you use, and it depends on the hash function. So if we use SNARK-friendly components, like the baby jub elliptic curve and the Poseidon hash function, which have very low algebra, low arithmetic circuit representation, then you get numbers like this. The CRS is less than a megabyte, and you run for a second to generate the proof. That's very nice, but it's cheating, right? Because we said we want a blind signing scheme for something that's already used in practice. So now we have to deal with the Bitcoin parameters, which is the SecP curve and SHA-2 as the hash function. And now, of course, things get ugly. You have this the circuit representation of the statement has 1 million constraints in R1CS specification, and so your CRS becomes half a gigabyte, and the prover runs for a minute. But it's not. I argue it's not that shocking, because if you look at what happened with the first generation of Zcash, then they claim that to produce a shielded transaction, the prover runtime was 2 minutes. So these are numbers that didn't prevent adoption in the past. As I said, the problem is really that these. So for the SNARKs, we used BN254 curves, and they're not compatible with the Bitcoin curve, right? Because the fields are different. And if this is what you need, because you need pairings for these snarks. So if you use a snark that doesn't use pairings, like Spartan, then you can actually use the proof, make the proof use the twin curve of the Bitcoin curve, sec_q, whose order is the prime of that curve. So this thing works really well together. So we expected this to be really efficient, but yeah, CRS nice, but the proof at time was even slower. But we think that's really because nothing was optimized of the libraries that we used. So this should be a lot faster. So if you look at this blind signing protocol, then the user proves some statement that involves the message, right? And so an idea would be, can the user not in addition prove any predicate of that message? And that actually gives an instantiation of a primitive that seems very useful but hasn't been defined in the literature, which we call predicate blind signatures. I think it's quite an obvious thing you might want to have. It's a generalization of partially blind signatures where the signer has some control over the messages that it signs. And so the idea is that now there's a predicate that the signer and the user agree on. They run this protocol, and then the signer is guaranteed that the message that it signed satisfies the predicate, and the user is guaranteed that that's all the signer learns. Okay, and now, yeah, let's conclude with a silly example. What you can do with this.
I'm sorry, the point is any verifier also learns about the predicate.
No, that's the thing, right? In partially blind signatures, if you say that the public part of it is kind of the predicate of the message, that's something that the verifier learns. And the nice thing about these predicate blind signatures is that the result is a signature on a message and nothing else, and it's completely independent of the predicate.
I see. So the point here is that the signer may only want to sign certain messages, such as messages that don't break the law or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Okay, so to conclude, here's a speculative application of this. So meet Sam, the signer who runs a cryptocurrency exchange. And you know, these days people, they don't own their Bitcoins, they're actually in the exchange. And can we still have anonymous payments? And I argue that with this predicate blind signatures you could. So what the user could do is create a Bitcoin transaction from an address of the exchange and then have it signed blindly. Normally an exchange would never do that because it might lose all its money, which is what happens sometimes. So what you could do is use as a predicate that the amount of this transaction that you're signing is less than some value V. And then the exchange can just debit the user account by V. And yeah, and this becomes secure. I mean, like, this is assuming that there's a lot of people doing the same thing. So you have an anonymity set. There's only one address of the exchange. So it's not like realistic, but just to some example. That's it. So I thought since the Banksy Museum is just around the corner, I might also put this picture here and yeah, open for questions.
So have there been better fixes for the ROS that avoid general purpose NIZARD?
Not to my knowledge. So it seems, seems like we're still state of the art, which I don't see how there's any better way around it. It's like, it's really what you want to do is now optimize that snark. But like this idea, to prevent the attack is you have to avoid the user from manipulating the C values and what other ways are there?
Actually, maybe I should have asked this like in the beginning of the talk, but you also care about here that like a malicious user cannot use the interactive protocol to learn something about the key, or something like that, right? Like
that is basically covered by unforgeability, right?
I see.
Yeah, it's.
Oh, okay. That you're saying unforgeability already covers.
Yeah,
if
you learn something, I don't know. Like, obviously, if you learn a few bits about the key, you can't forge. But there's like, I mean, in the end,
that unforgeability holds only when the user behaved correctly in the protocol or something, but
but that would be very weak, right? You want to have.
Of course. Yes,
but I'm saying that, I mean, the only property, like, why do you care about leaking bits of your key as long as no one can make signatures of it, and no one can make signatures because that's unforgeability.
So would you say is there a big open question in blind signatures, or like, but differently, like 5 years from now, is there something you really hope the community has proven or constructed?
I mean, if it's for Bitcoin, it needs to be Schnorr, right? Because they're not gonna put the different signature in there.
How about zooming out?
Zooming out, I still think like in the end you want to use standardized signatures. So I still think Schnorr is a very good target for optimizing blind signature issuing.
So you think the most important thing is just to have better snarks for it to be practical?
Unless someone finds a different way of securing it.
So if you did ECDSA blind signing, do you run into the same, let's assume the enforgeability game reduces to producing an ECDSA signature.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if ECDSA is secure now, but I'll assume that.
Yeah.
With the instantiation of SHA-256 or whatever. Do
Do
you need the same kind of proving? With
I don't know.
general purpose
I would have to look it up. The thing is that these other tricks we used, they really only work for Schnorr, right? This adapter signature. So in that sense, if you want that application, you already want Schnorr. But just blind signing, maybe there is you can show that heuristically ECDSA blind signing is already concurrently secure.
Do you feel like with good enough snarks, these would be used?
I mean, depending on how interested people are in privacy, right? If you look at Zcash, this was used, right? This shielded transaction. So yes, I think so. And I think, as I said, like the fact that you can use that this sec-p curve happens to have a twin curve gives you a lot of room to play with, because then this group arithmetic becomes native for the snark.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's nothing standing in the way of very fast provers with very nice verifier costs for this.
I mean, SHA will be the big cost, right? Because unless with your techniques you can do this faster because you don't represent it as a circuit. I don't know.
Probably today the 2.5 minutes could be, a couple seconds or something.
Yeah. Then I think it's usable, right? If you trust the snark.
Does this blind paradigm make sense for more things? Blind encryption, blind snarks, I don't know, like blind cryptography. I want to have an interactive protocol where a signer encrypts something for me, but they don't know what they're encrypting.
I mean,
that
that's
even makes any sense.
I guess witness encryption could be kind of viewed as this.
Is that essentially?
But I think zero-knowledge proofs are, in a way, already if they're simulation sound, there are already a generalization of signatures, because you can, you prove some statement, and even if you've seen a lot of proofs, you can't make new proofs. That's simulation soundness. And then if that statement is, I know my secret key, that's a signature scheme. But that statement might be anything. So in that sense, as
I need to know the statement I'm proving, though. Is there a way for me to prove a statement I don't know?
Well, you need to prove something, right? So there's some meta statement, and then the statement just becomes a witness.
Asking,
yeah.
But you could generate a proof under an encryption.
I see. Okay.
And then you give it back to the guy who decrypts it.
FHE
but somebody
does solve
needs,
everything.
No, but somebody needs to know the witness, right?
Yeah,
you need to extract from somewhere.
Yes.
I mean, let's say functional encryption solves more than FHE, right? Because then FHE, it's still, you can't delegate decryption in a restricted way to someone else, right? It's only you decrypt it or you don't in FHE. In functional encryption, you can say, yes, you can decrypt, but you'll only obtain a function of the message. So in that sense, it's more general. But it doesn't solve everything.
Thanks again.